Spring Boot roadmap. How to approach learning Spring and Spring Boot when you are a new person to this ecosystem and never touched it before. Of course, there could be different roads you can take to learn Spring, but I think this is like the most natural way to learn Spring and Spring Boot that I actually recommend in the Spring Boot Academy, so my private community for Spring Boot developers. And of course, before we start with Spring and Spring Boot, we have to have some fundamentals of the implementation language. Of course, you could put here Kotlin, Groovy, or any other JVM language, but of course, Java is the most common. And if you, for example, know Kotlin or Groovy, you probably also know Java. So Java it is. And here we have, of course, Java fundamentals. So OOP concepts like classes, inheritance, and so on, exceptions, collections, lambdas, streams, generics, and annotations. All of these things will be used when learning Spring and Spring Boot. So you need to have some like basic understanding of them. Of course, you don't have to know like everything about lambdas, streams, and generics. But it would be nice if you just know what it is and like are comfortable in using all of these Java concepts. Next, you have to have some basic understanding of Java build systems, and here you can use Maven, Gradle, or I think there are some like different also build systems, but Maven and Gradle are the main ones. So like I put only Maven and Gradle here. And you basically need to only know how to run applications using this and also how to add dependencies, which is like 5 minutes of learning, and you can learn it when learning Spring. Next, we have another module, which is Spring Boot Fundamentals. And here we have Spring Fundamentals. So basically we have Spring Framework and Spring Boot. And Spring Boot is built upon the Spring Framework. And then Spring Framework gives us inversion of control and dependency injection. Also, we have here the project structure, how to create projects using the Spring Initializer. Of course, we have also beans. Bean is basically a Java object that is managed by Spring Framework. And here we have the Spring bean configuration, bean scopes, and bean life cycles, and how to hook to these different steps of the bean life cycle. Next, we have the Spring Boot core. And here we have started dependencies, which is like a huge library of dependencies and libraries that are tested to work together and are commonly also used together. And they are prepared by the Spring Boot team for you to use. Of course, we have different profiles. So profiles are basically a way to configure your application to run in different environments. For example, you use different databases in production and in development, and you can configure that in profiles, for example. Of course, we have auto configuration for different dependencies. So instead to having to configure, for example, a web server or memory database, you can just trust the Spring Boot team to do it for you with auto configuration. We have Spring Model View Controller. Basically, I should probably put it here, but at this point, you can also learn how the model view controller works in Spring. We have the bin validation, so how to validate your objects if they have correct values. We also have here controller advice, which is for exception. It's basically a powerful system for exception handling. So instead of catching your exceptions, you trust the Spring Boot system to then you can configure basically what should be returned to the client when there's some exception. Next, we have database integration. And basically, you can skip this part and, for example, first learn how to create REST APIs. And when you learn how to create REST APIs, you just use in-memory database and ignore the data persistence. And after you learn that, you can learn database integration and implement the data persistence. But I think the most natural way and the way I recommend in the Spring Boot Academy is to learn database integration first. So have this nice base to then create controllers and so on. And database integration in Spring is done using the Spring Data JPA. And Spring Data JPA is this whole framework for working with databases that it can be used with different database providers like MySQL, PostgreSQL, basically every database you can think of. And before we learn database integration, it would be nice if we also have some basics of, I don't know, MySQL, PostgreSQL are the most common ones. So if you know like basics of one of those, it would be, you should be fine. And also some SQL fundamentals like basic queries, selects, joins, relations, procedures, and transactions. But also you can learn it side by side with Spring Data GPA. It shouldn't be a big problem. Next, we have some lazy loading, fetch types, custom queries, and how to make database migrations using Flyway or Liquidbase, how to implement entity relations, DTOs, so data transfer objects that are used in REST APIs, but also in your database. And in this context, we call DTOs projections, and we use them, for example, for custom dynamic queries. Of course, query methods provided by the Spring Data GPA in your repositories, and also Java persistent query language, which also can be used with Spring Data GPA to making custom queries, and also classic pagination and sorting for your queries. And next, we have two paths we can choose, and that, of course, you can learn both of this stuff, but creating full stack applications in Spring is much less common. So I think you would be safe to skip this part if you don't want to create full stack applications and only create REST APIs. So I'm gonna start with the MVC apps that you can, of course, skip. And in MVC apps, we have the HTML template languages, like, for example, Timeleaf. We have form handling, static resources, how the static resources work, and how to combine a REST API with Timeleaf. So how to make controllers that also can have REST endpoints. And before learning MVC apps, it would be nice if you have some front-end basics like JavaScript, HTML, CSS, because we're gonna use all of it to create full-stack applications, full-stack server-side applications using Spring MVC and, for example, Timeleaf. And of course, like CSS, CSS libraries, and so on. We don't need any JavaScript frameworks because Timeleaf and Spring MVC are basically your framework for creating these apps. And instead of learning MVC apps, you can go the left path, so creating REST APIs. And here we have REST controller, rate limiting, how to create requests, how to upload files, how to download files, how the modern web client and REST client works. Basically, web client is the modern reactive way that is much more verbose, but is non-blocking. And we have REST client that is the basic blocking client for external REST calls. Before learning how to create REST APIs, it would be nice to have some backend theory, but also you can learn this side by side, as I said, in every part before. So, like, what are the HTTP status codes, like success 2000, not found for 404, basically the basic REST API patterns, like, for example, modern view controller, controller repository service, and so on. Basically, like stuff you can learn in 15 minutes, but it would be nice to have it before you learn how to do it in Spring Boot. Next step, we have the API security. So we have Spring has this all project, like this big project called Spring Security that are used to secure your applications for authentication and so on. You can also implement your custom authentication, but it's like much less common. And before you learn that, it would be nice to have like some authentication theory, like what are the JWT authentication tokens, what are the roles, authorities, maybe some OAuth 2. Okay, and next, of course, we have testing here. You could learn testing side by side with all of that, but I think it's like, to not like complicate things, it would be nice to learn testing after you learn, for example, how to create REST APIs or how to create MVC apps. So you have some stuff to test actually with your code. So like the natural progression, I think, is to learn testing after all of that. And here we have like unit test with the JUnit library. We have Mockito for like the more integrated testing. We have test containers for the databases, mock MVC to test your MVC applications, like the frontend part. We also have web test client, and you can also learn tools like, for example, Postman or Swagger to test your APIs. And after we learn all of that, it's not not the end. It's like, I know there's a lot of stuff, but Spring and Spring Boot are so big ecosystems that you can do a lot of stuff. And for example, we have like next steps that you can take to grow in this ecosystem. And we have, for example, different projects in Spring ecosystem like Spring AI, Spring Cloud, Spring Batch, and Spring Shell. I think the Spring AI is the most interesting here, and I'm definitely going to do a course about it soon. We have some advanced topics for the REST APIs like GraphQL, microservices, reactive programming, messaging queues like RabbitMQ or Kafka, and caching with a tool like, for example, Redis. These are like the advanced topics that you should go after finishing this, all of that. And also, if you want to be more like a well-rounded programmer, also you should learn some the basics of DevOps and deployment. So Dockerizing Spring Boot applications. Actuator is a tool for like monitoring your applications. It provides additional endpoints for like performance and so on. Also like some basics of Kubernetes, so like working with multiple instances of applications. Some basics of AWS, Google Cloud Provider, and Azure. We basically can choose one of that because you are never gonna use all of them. And maybe some basics of CI/CD with GitHub Actions. And I think that's it for this video. I think I gave you a basic understanding of what you need to learn when starting with Spring Boot. Of course, if you want to learn more about that, you can join my Spring Boot Academy. There's top link in the description where I put all of my full courses and guides. And you also can meet other people that are on the same journey with you. And also you can subscribe to this channel and see my other free guides. And I think that's it. Here is the next video you should watch. Until next time, create some amazing applications.